Greetings all and welcome to Progressive Washington, hosted by Uphill Media, brought to you by the Progressive Party of Washington State. Today we're going to talk about death and justice with the case of Stonechild Chiefstick, and as usual, more listening than talking. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass the talking stick and ask our guests to introduce yourselves, and then we'll get into the story of what happened a year ago today. Gabe, you want to start by just giving us who you are and where you come from?
Yeah, Tyler, thanks for having me and Gyasi on. My name is Gabe Galanda. I'm an Indigenous rights lawyer here in Seattle, Washington. I belong to the Round Valley Indian Confederation of Northern California and descend from the Nomlaki and Concow bands of our confederation. I was born and raised in Port Angeles, Washington, not too awfully far from where Stonechild Chiefstick lost his life a year ago, in about 6 hours a year ago today. But as I said earlier, I now make my home in Seattle, where I've lived for the last 20 years.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Josh, do you want to tell us who you are?
Yes. Thank you for having us. Thank you, Gabe, for being my brother, my comrade, and not just in this case, this horrible situation, but also in many things. For those of you folks who do not know, Gabe will never say it, but he's one of the most prolific champions of Indigenous rights in the courtroom and outside the courtroom as well. And so it's an honor to be on here with you and also work in this case with you. Oki Tanatapi, Natanako Unagumsaka, Nitontu tu Amskapi Pakani. My name is Gyasi Ross. I come from the Blackfeet people who are now within the homelands of what is now known as Montana. Directly south of the Canadian border, about 30 miles south, about 30 miles east of what is now known as Glacier National Park. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. My family also comes from the Suquamish Indian Reservation. Excuse me, the Suquamish Indian Reservation, which is on the Olympic Peninsula, and also is one of the places where Stonechild Chiefstick, who I'll be referring to as either Mr. Chiefstick or Stony, because I did have a personal relationship with him. He lived there for a very long time, and it's also a beautiful place. And I'm thankful to have this platform, this venue to talk to you folks and to visit about our dearly departed and the impact that it's had on his family, on the community, and on Native people in general. And we'll talk about the larger global implications in a little while, I imagine.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get to all of it. We've got time. Gyasi, I understand you're also a storyteller, and this is the time for it. It's been a year, and the story needs to be told. I mean, if you're comfortable, could you just cut loose and tell it as it is?
Sure. And, just to be clear, you're obviously a storyteller as well. Gabe is a storyteller. I believe that, all Indigenous people, we happen to be the best storytellers in the world, but all of us have a story to tell. And a lot of those stories right now are coming out. And whereas previously people didn't listen to those stories about injustice, those stories about people being treated a certain way and people not believing them or saying that it's unimportant. And a lot of those stories are coming to light right now. And that's a really, really good thing. This particular story started off, I imagine, kind of celebratory. As many people who, subscribe to this myth of the 4th of July of Independence Day during this time of year. Right now, obviously, it's the 3rd of July. It has this spirit of jubilation and the spirit of, for many people on the Suquamish Indian Reservation, of opportunity. And the reason why is not necessarily linked to the American mythology, but because, like many of us, I grew up, and many of the people that are on the reservation, is an opportunity to make money, sell fireworks. And fireworks are a really big deal. Oftentimes that was something that contributed heavily to our economy after our economies were intentionally stripped of a lot of things of value within Native communities. And so there's both a customary as well as a pragmatic import to this time of year to a lot of Native people. And I think that it's different than what a lot of Americans that import to them. For us, it's more about opportunity and being able to provide for our families. Last year on this day, it was a really, really bad sequence of events that, a lot of the facts will be developed later. But there was a man named Mr. Chiefstick Stoney, who I believe needed some support. He needed, some help, and he had certain things that were, I believe, a call for help. And that sequence of events, like they happened in different places. So if you go through the things that have been submitted as facts so far to the investigation of the police officer that was involved in the killing of Mr. Stonechild Chiefstick, you have that he went to initially what's it called, GameStop. And, and it's interesting. It tells you about the surveillance that we have in this day and age, where every moment can be accounted for most of us. But he went there, and, there was nothing of really eventful that happened at that particular place. But people were keeping tabs on this very, very large Native man who was about my size. He was about, he was a little bit not quite as tall. He was about 6'3", about 250 pounds, big guy, brown skin. From there, he went over, if you know the city of Paulsbo, there's a Walmart there right by the GameStop. So then he went over to the Walmart and apparently didn't go inside. But people were keeping tabs on him. There was always somebody noticing him, which if you grow up as a large brown skinned person, you're used to being noticed. It happens a lot. And particularly in a place that has a population as white as Paulsbo, Washington, and many places in Washington State, you're used to being noticed. It's something of consequence. And so, he from Walmart, evidently he went back to the Squamish Indian Reservation, and it was in preparation for the big shindig on the waterfront on Paulsbo, Washington. Happens every single year. It's a big deal. They spend, however many tens of thousands of dollars on fireworks to have a good time, and people are there and they're feeling good and feeling patriotic or whatever they're feeling. And a lot of times, by the way, they're also feeling intoxicated. That's not an uncommon thing, because this is a party. And so by, all accounts, he went to this place, looked like everybody else did, looking to, sharing that celebratory feeling, to go there and hang out. And I'm guessing, and I think from the toxicology, results, it sounds like he participated just like every other person participated there, in hanging out and having a good time. Then I believe, based upon the facts that have been sort of stipulated to, for whatever reason, that attention that he was getting early on, where people took the time to notice him in GameStop, to reconstruct his path to Walmart and these other places, I think people started to notice him in the wrong way. And I believe that is a very, very common thing, where our behaviors, and when I say ours, I'm talking about brown-skinned people, specifically larger brown-skinned people, it gets magnified and people pay a lot of attention to those things. And the same behaviors that other people, they might take for granted, with those people, they're not. And based upon, assortment of witnesses, based upon what would be considered closest to objective evidence, while he was there, the police talked to him several times about him staring at people. He was looking at people. I think one of the officers described it as a 1,000-yard stare. I'm not sure what that looks like. I don't know if there's an objective criterion for a 1,000-yard stare, or even when staring at somebody ceases to be something that is just a whimsical gaze, or alternatively, when it actually necessitates or predicates police intervention. I practice in the court of law, criminal court primarily, and I've never seen police intervene based upon stares. But these police did, as a matter of objective fact. They talked to him several times based upon this, and may or may not have created some enmity in the relationship between Mr. Chiefstick and these police officers. I don't know. But no matter what happened, at one point, the officer who ended up who killed Mr. Chiefstick, he was alerted that this large Native man, was staring at some people, and he went over to have evidently a conversation. And at that time, he noticed that there was a screwdriver, that he had a screwdriver, and that evidently some people around him, felt uncomfortable when they noticed this large man with a screwdriver. And at that time, and I'm going to give this part kind of short shrift. I actually avoided watching the video for a long time until Mr. Galanda, Gabe, and I officially, signed on to this case because, again, I know this man. I know his family. My son plays with his children. They grew up playing sports together. So it's not something that I really want to see if I can avoid it. But, I watched the video, and the officer, Craig Keller, intervenes. Stoney, from my take, a lot of it is just audio because the video, the body cam, it fell. And perhaps coincidentally, there was another incident regarding the use of force from the same officer, Craig Keller, in, I believe, 2018. Similarly, in that same incident, the body cam, which is supposed to protect all participants involved, also fell. So we can't really get a good objective viewpoint of what happened based upon something, that has a consistent pattern of happening. But you hear the words, you hear Stoney saying, "Chill out." I think it was "Chill out, man." I think that was the exact thing he said. "Chill out, man." And there was some sort of scuffle. Unfortunately, we don't have body cam footage to count for the veracity of the statements. But next thing, there was gunshots, and there was 2 gunshots, and almost into a crowd of probably a couple thousand people. None of the other officers shot, and there was Mr. Chiefstick dead. And it was a really, really sudden, and really, the facts will play out how they play out, but it was a really, really escalated quickly response to somebody that, was having a pretty casual conversation not a few seconds earlier. Somebody who these officers were familiar with. They were familiar with them. That's a matter of record from both Mr. Keller's time on the Port Gamble S'Klallam tribal police, but also from the Paulsbo police. And, perhaps knew a little bit about this, person, Mr. Chiefstick's tendencies, what he would do and what he would not do. And, there might not have been, and again, these facts will be borne out, but, had an indication of what this person was capable of. And I will submit that there's nothing in the record that's, that says that there was anything to indicate that Mr. Chiefstick was capable of something that required deadly force, and the actions didn't require deadly force. But, that part we'll talk about. But that's a, real 30,000 foot view of the events, the tragedy of July 3rd, 2019. Of course, the impacts are still happening in real time. You have kids who don't have their dad there. You have, a lack of a lot of different types of supports. But that, in a nutshell, is what happened on that particular day.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. Gabe, I think I just passed straight to you because there's so much to get through. I just want to hear what you guys have to say. Maybe step into the legal side of what this looks like from the nuts and bolts.
Sure. Well, let's also introduce Stoney as a father of 5 children. 1 is an adult child, 4 are not. He had at least 1 sister, to my knowledge. He was survived by his mother. And as Gyasi tells the story, I just have to ask, was he okay on the night of the 3rd? Was he okay earlier in the day at Walmart or GameStop? You can at least look at the surveillance and ask the question, was he okay? And he may not have been okay. It's an honest question to ask, standing in a crowd of thousands with a screwdriver, if he was okay. That's a question that will be explored, but it was not explored by law enforcement. In 10 seconds, he was shot dead. 10 seconds from Keller's original encounter to the second when he shot and killed him was as long as it took. In 10 seconds, you cannot ask and answer the question, is this man okay? You cannot ask and answer the question, does he need some form of help other than what law enforcement can provide? Does he need a medic? Does he need a behavioral therapist? Is there somebody else who can engage him to make sure he is okay, and therefore the people around him are okay? And that did not happen. The reason I say that, and by further of introduction, we represent and have represented at least 3 other families who in Western Washington suffered the loss of a loved one to law enforcement. Renee Davis was pregnant and had 2 children in a nearby room when she was suicidal. And the King County sheriffs were called for a welfare check. They arrived, one of them off duty, who had spent an entire day at a shooting range, and in a minute, with the children in the room next door, they shot and killed her dead. She was in a mental health crisis. She needed help. The cops showed up and killed her. Cecil Lacey Jr., late one night on the Tulalip Indian Reservation, walked down Marine Drive, a busy state route in Snohomish County. There was a call to 911 that a man was acting erratically in the roadway. Snohomish County deputy arrived along with 2 Tulalip police. And before he knew it, he was in the exact same prone position as George Floyd, with the deputy's knee in the small of his back, and his last 3 words, I can't breathe. 15 seconds later, he stopped breathing and died. Daniel Covarrubias, a Suquamish man, also with several children, I believe 5 or 6, had a schizophrenic episode in Pierce County. He went to a hospital because he was seeing things. The hospital discharged him and he was walking home through the city of Lakewood. He walked through a lumber yard, ended up 25 feet in the air on top of a lumber pile. And then he was afraid to get down. In the meantime, Lakewood police were called. They arrived. They immediately got out a shotgun or a rifle and pointed at him. He was afraid for his life, reached for what we believe was a cell phone to call his mom, and he was shot dead. My point is telling these stories is there's something in common with all 4 of those encounters. An Indigenous person was in a mental health episode or a crisis and needed help. And they ended up dead. And their children ended up without a father or a mother. But turning back to Stoney's case, I want to talk about what happens after the gun is fired. Because at the moment somebody loses their life to a police officer, it's a matter of potential homicide. The investigation is into a potential crime of homicide. But what happens within moments of a fatality such as the ones we're talking about is cover-up. Cover-up by all layers of local government, including the police, so-called investigators, prosecuting attorneys, coroners, and others. Here, the investigation commenced soon after July 3rd. We don't know if a lawyer for the police guild that represents the Paulsville Police showed up on July 3rd, but I can tell you in the situation at Tulalip, the guild's lawyer showed up that night and sequestered the cop before any investigator could talk to them. Here, we do know that the guild brought a lawyer in, and for at least a couple of weeks, Keller and the other 3 officers for the Paulsbo PD were sequestered from the so-called investigator. That allows the Guild, who keeps lawyers on retainer for situations like July 3rd, 2019, time to get a lawyer out to talk to the cops before anybody else talks to them, including the so-called investigator. That's where the narrative starts to develop, that the cell phone looked like a gun, or he lunged at me, or the screwdriver looked like a gun, or he had threatened somebody's life. It's when lawyers intercede within minutes to hours to days of a fatality and start to change the narrative to allow the officer to escape criminal inquiry. I'm not even talking about liability, but just criminal inquiry and ultimately civil liability. Now, the so-called investigators. Here we have a Kitsap County cop with a previous affiliation with Keller doing the so-called investigation. In Tulalip, Marysville, we had a detective from the city of Marysville doing an investigation of his brother on the Snohomish County Police Force. There's no objectivity to those investigations. They are not legitimate investigations. These are cops pretending to investigate other cops. And they are primarily why cops are not getting charged when they do something that's criminal. And I'm not suggesting that every death results from a crime. More often than not, they are mistakes. But there's not even criminal inquiry because of guild counsel and investigators that are always of some other relationship, pre-existing relationship to the cop. So now the investigators are involved in Kitsap County, the guild lawyers are involved, the cops are sequestered. But by the time the lawyers are involved with the cops and now the investigator, the narrative is that a screwdriver assault occurred because they have found other situations where other individuals wielded a screwdriver and something went wrong. We've also heard the cell phone looked like a gun. The point is, it is a narrative developed by the investigative team or so-called investigative team and the police guild and its lawyers. You also hear, as you have heard with Stoney's case, I feared for my life. All 4 cops said they feared for their lives. When it's hard to establish, when at least one didn't even bring a gun out, let alone a taser, the other 2 only handled tasers, that they feared for their lives. That is a narrative developed to get the cops off from civil liability under what's called the felonious conduct statute in the state of Washington, where if you are committing a felony, you cannot sue a cop for what went wrong. The idea is, I feared for my life, an assault was committed upon me as a police officer, a felony was committed, and therefore civil liability cannot attach. Another thing that emerges from the so-called investigation or the evidence, Gyasi already alluded to it, the body cam wasn't activated. The body cam fell off. Candidly, the body cam footage was spoiled or concealed. We have seen in too many cases, like the Marysville case that I just talked about, like Stoney's case, like other cases Gyasi's alluding to, where conveniently the body cam footage is gone. Again, it was neither activated, it just happened to fall off in a 10-second encounter, or it exists, but it's being withheld as evidence. Ultimately, the guild lawyer and the investigator work with others like the coroner or the medical examiner. Not in Stoney's case, because the cause of death is obvious, but in other cases where it's perhaps asphyxiation, like in George Floyd's instance. We saw the situation where originally the coroner suggested he died of some other cause, cardiac arrest, arrhythmia, something else. Well, as it turns out later in George Floyd's case, as we know it to be in the Tulalip Marysville case, it was from asphyxiation. My point is, you have another culpable actor in the cover-up in the medical examiner. And all of this is with a view towards court, keeping the police away from a criminal inquiry or liability, keeping the police force insulated or inoculated from civil liability. And it's not about dollars and cents or even criminal accountability as much as it is the impunity that then runs to the cops. There is no consequence to the police officer or officers, to the police force, to the local government, to the state of Washington, There's no consequence to them. So what happens? Rinse, repeat. It happens again and again and again and again and again. And so what we are now focused on doing, Indigenous lawyers like myself, along with Indigenous nations like the Puyallup tribe and advocates from all across our state and our country, is figuring out how to reform a completely broke system that allows the next Black or brown life to be taken from us without any accountability or culpability whatsoever.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. I mean, as I listen to you gentlemen speak, I'm always wanting to make a difference and figuring out how can we make a difference. Whereas if we'd had this conversation even 5 years ago, it might have seemed a little more hopeless than it would today, given that today we see this popular uprising of a desire for justice. And, I don't think the Black Lives Matter movement forgets Indian struggle at all. I think that, I see lots of evidence that the two are one and the same. But I also, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I see evidence that in the greater context of things, that the Indigenous struggle is being a little bit isn't getting the same attention, anyways. And so, with that context, here we are. At least we have a platform to speak on the issue. But where and how? I mean, if you guys are on the front lines of this thing, it sounds like you have been for a long time. Where does the average viewer, the casual person who happens to be listening to these words, where do we start? I mean, I know there's an action for Stonechild this evening in Paulsville, and I think there was one that just happened. But can you give us some guidance? Because there's a lot of people who care. That's what we're seeing in these times, is that the average person does actually care and would like to make a difference. Where would you point them?
Go ahead, Johnson.
Yeah. So I want to push back just a little bit. That I think the average person cares to the degree that it's. I mean, and this is let me rephrase that. Let me not be so humble. Evidence shows that as it pertains to Native people, the average person cares to the point that something is hot or expedient. And that's something that there's been evidence of that for, decades and decades, that, if there was a hierarchy of concerns regarding different communities that were considered marginalized or discrete, Native people would almost, invariably be at the bottom of the list. How do we know that? And this is just something, because I want to buffer this statement a little bit. How do we know that? Well, because right now it's kind of cool. You're seeing a movement on social media and, about mascots, right? You're seeing it, and where there might actually be movement. But this is 2020. Then this has been allowed to exist until 2020. Moreover, Native people, we suffer violent crimes at the highest rates of anybody in the country. Nobody knows that. The hallmark of Native oppression, if you want to call it that, is that nobody knows. Nobody ever knows that this is happening to us. And that's been something that's been consistent, irrespective of what the particular topic is, whether you're talking about police officer involved shootings, whether you're talking about violent crimes, whether you're talking about expulsions and suspensions from schools for Native students. It always happens, and nothing's changed. It's been a consistent theme for decades, but nobody knows those things. So I don't necessarily agree with you regarding the willingness of non-Native people to get involved in Native struggle. Now, we do have this moment that has been absolutely created by people in response to specifically Black people getting killed by law enforcement, and has been created by Black Lives Matter movement, and it's been powerful. And there's absolutely, just like any other time Black folks have taken charge of a particular civil rights struggle or human rights struggle, there are corollary beneficiaries. And that might be something that, might happen for Native people in this particular instance, that we are taken along for the ride for some benefit that happens tangentially. And that's cool. That's really cool. And I'm thankful for that. I'll always be grateful for those people who step up first. That's powerful. It's amazing. But regarding specific action steps, there's a multitude. Gabe alluded to a few of those, regarding the de-escalate action, the tribes that have taken agency and self-determination to try to affect legislation. There's been, I believe, reasonable critique of whether or not that legislation is going to be, enough. And I'd say that, the malice standard is a start, but Gabe talked about all of the structural places, the pressure points where things can go wrong and oftentimes do go wrong for these investigations to bring a particular outcome that usually does not favor us. In fact, it never favors us, like as an absolute, right, Gabe? It never favors us. And so how do you do that? Well, one piece of information that's been, came forth in the past couple weeks during this pressure that was created by Black people after the George Floyd killing, the George Floyd murder, and Black Lives Matter movement, and there's been this pressure, has been, a willingness to revisit cases of police-involved killings. And that came from Attorney General Bob Ferguson. That's a good thing. That's a good place. Like, we want to actually revisit this and look at the facts again. And also, in fairness, this person, the prosecuting attorney for Kitsap County, Chad Enright, he said that, well, I think that we should have an outside independent person investigate police-involved shootings in Kitsap County that has no pre-existing relationship, as Gabe talked about, with these police officers. And it seems obvious. Duh, of course it should be an independent person that has no pre-existing relationship, but it hasn't been obvious because we know that because it's continued to go on. So that's a really, really positive step. And I think something that makes that could make a difference ultimately in outcomes. I don't know. But so if we're looking at pressure points right now, one thing that I've been encouraging is for people to get in contact with Bob Ferguson. He's drew a kind of an arbitrary limit of 2020 that we want to revisit police-involved shootings from 2020. But that assumes that ones that happened previous to 2020 were legitimate and some way objective. I don't think that's a fair assumption. And so, Stonechild, again, was, and I'll use this word very, very loosely. My co-counsel Gabe doesn't like the word, but he was murdered, in my estimation, in July of 2019. Well, that arbitrary standard then cuts off that very, very important date for us. So we need to include those, and anything where there's been some sort of questions regarding the facts. It can't be based upon a arbitrary chronological date. It has to be based upon the facts. There's a lot of questions of facts in this Stonechild Chiefstick case. And so we need to revisit those facts again, have a new investigation. And so, your question about pressure points, I would say to communicate, to write emails and to call Bob Ferguson's office and say that we need to reopen this investigation with an objective inquiry that's consistent, by the way, with the prosecuting attorney who reviewed that case, Chad Enright. We're just giving Chad Enright what he wants, which is an independent investigation.
Yeah. This brings to mind another conversation. I mean, this issue is so huge, and it goes back obviously centuries. There's no easy answer, but what I'm looking for here is to harness some stuff that's already happening. And so I'm just going to throw this out as a possibility of something to chew on for all of us. What do you guys think about this popular movement where people are kind of getting up and for example, taking down statues? And what do you think about the fact that Trump's about to hold a rally at Mount Rushmore, and there's talk of actually, taking that symbolism down, from the perspective of a symbologist or a storyteller? Does that even matter? Is that if a given person's energy is going into, say, let's give Mount Rushmore back to the Lakota and let them do what they will with it? Is that a valid motion towards change in either of your perspectives?
I'm gonna let Gyasi have that one too. That's right in his wheelhouse.
Well, okay. So here's the thing. It shouldn't be either or, right, Tyler? that we need things of substance, and we need the symbolism to be reconsidered as well. And I'm not an advocate of taking everything that's offensive down or canceling it or erasing or anything like that, but it definitely needs to be contextualized. This is a huge insult, and this isn't my opinion. This is people, my Lakota relatives in South Dakota. Nick Tilson, the chair of the Indian Collective, was just on MSNBC talking about it yesterday. This is a huge insult to Native people that live right there. It's forever in your backyard, and it's something that was, I believe, intended to be somewhat of a scarecrow. That no, this is actually supposed to have a tangible, quantifiable effect on the daily activities of the Native people there, to know forever that this is what America values. This is what they value. It's not you that's up there in this mountain. That's a sacred spot for you, that's been around since time immemorial and you've had a relationship with. It's not you that's there, that's being worshipped and deified and carved into stone, but it's these white dudes that did horrible things to people like you and to other people of color. That has, in my estimation, an amazing effect on the psyche of a person that has to look up that and see that every single day. Similar to the Confederate flag, where we see Confederate flag, this people value this, that, it's something that had a absolutely tangible bad effect on a lot of specifically Black people, but also Native people. And how could this ever be a symbol that we can get behind? But yet this is what you memorialize and formalize every single day in my eyes. So again, I'm not a fan of destroying everything or erasing or canceling, but it certainly needs to be contextualized at the very least. Moreover, I don't want it to be something, any of these things. And I think that, Gabe probably is, like, this is part of the conversation of why he handed this to me, is like, one of the things that happens, we get to November 2020, Donald Trump gets out of office and the Wicked Witch is gone. And all of a sudden everything is right. The problem with symbols is that it can be a panacea. That we think that because that symbol's gone, that the structural racism or oppression that happens underneath that is actually gone with the symbol. And we can't confuse the two. And we're not confused about the two, by the way, but sometimes that's the danger of white liberals and white allies, is that they feel because the symbol's gone that the problem is fixed. And that's just not the case.
Yeah, I hear that. Gabe, you want to add anything?
Well, to state what Gyasi's talking about contributes to a lived trauma of each and every Indigenous person in this country. And we don't have time to talk about, the last 250 to 500 years, East Coast to West Coast, manifest destiny, and what that legacy of imperialism has done to Indigenous peoples. But just trust that every Indigenous person in this country suffers trauma because of what has happened to our ancestors. It could be a monument, a mascot, bloodshed. There's trauma there. And it speaks to what I think underlies most of these police encounters, just as it does our kids entering the juvenile justice system disproportionately to any other demographic in our country, or our children and our adults entering prison disproportionately to any other demographic in the country, or being killed by the police. Yes, at the highest rate in the entire country. It's because the trauma has caused illness. And our society is no longer equipped to deal with the mentally ill. Ronald Reagan defunded community mental health. We have never been the same as society since. IHS for Indian people, which funds both on-reservation and urban medical care, meaning care to those still living in reservation communities and care living in places like Seattle, has been chronically underfunded. That funding results from promises made in treaties and federal law for hundreds of years. And those promises, of course, have been breached. We also suffer from the highest rates of opioid addiction or affliction. When you add all of those things together, that is why we're seeing Native people in mental health crisis at a disproportionate level, ultimately encountering the police disproportionately and dying at the hands of the police disproportionately. So Tyler, I think the conversation, be it under the moniker defund the police, which I'm not that enthused about because it's so polarizing, or any other police reform, has to focus on mental health care, mental health funding. Indigenous peoples in particular need that to sustain and survive. Beyond that, I would suggest no one in Washington, D.C. is going to solve this for any of us, no matter what color of skin we are. It is obvious the Supreme Court has no interest in solving this. This president sure as hell has no interest in solving it. And the Congress, Democrat or Republican, do not have the desire or the wherewithal to solve the problem. I have more hope in our local citizens and their relationship with city council persons, county commissioners, state legislators, police chiefs, neighbors, banding together and continuing a conversation to solve the problem locally. Outlaw qualified immunity at a local level, meaning tell your city council that their cops cannot invoke federal qualified immunity as a condition of their employment if they're ever sued for killing somebody. Supreme Court isn't going to do that for us, but city councils can. Get rid of the felonious conduct bar at the state legislature. I hope that the legislators from Kitsap County use this case to get rid of that bar that ultimately creates immunity and impunity for cops who kill people. And otherwise support any reform, again, starting with your local officials and your neighbors and your police, that will lead to the systemic unraveling of what gives rise to sham investigation and cover up when people are killed. Those are the things that we need to be focused on at a very local level, at a hyper local level, if we're going to solve this problem.
Yeah, good response. Music to my ears, to be honest. This whole idea of a ground up revolution, I think, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of energy to move in the right direction. That one of the things that people can sink their teeth into and go for. I'm seeing a question coming in from outside. In terms of fixing things, could you speak to defunding the police and prison abolition? I know you did just speak to defunding the police, and the point is well noted. Perhaps just the second half of the question.
Well, where are we going to put our mentally ill? Right now, the people I'm talking about, if they were to survive the police encounter, they go to a local jail. And I can't tell you the number of families that we've represented where that loved one then took their own life in that jail. But there's a whole nother host of families that we've helped. Again, it speaks to the fact that our system is broken as it relates to the people who are ill, and mentally ill in particular. So on this issue of mental illness, right now, at least they have a place to go. Because I've had relatives try to be admitted to Western State and been waitlisted. Again, I've had families who can't get mental health care for their loved ones, and they're actually pleased they can go to sleep at night hoping that in a jail, their loved one will live to see the next day. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen. So if we're going to abolish the police or the jail, what then are we going to do? And my point is, it's not binary. If we're going to defund the police, I'm okay with that as far as the monies will then be used for mental health care. If we're going to abolish jails, I may be okay with that as long as the resources are going to be dedicated to more hospital beds, more counselors, more mental health treatment. But we can't just say no jails, no cops. Right. Our society is not currently set up in a way that will succeed. So it isn't binary. It isn't either or. It has to be a combination of demilitarizing our police, reallocating funds from police to other community needs, and perhaps doing the same with our prison system.
Yeah, well, I hear that, and I think
Tyler,
that go ahead, man.
I would like to field that question because, I am a fan of the language and the perspective of defunding both police and prisons. But largely the same thought process as Gabe. I don't think we could go to complete fossil fuel free economy right now in 2020 because we don't have the infrastructure for it. That's going to take some time. That's going to take some planning. That's going to take some imagining. And I think that we absolutely need to start imagining and planning and creating the infrastructure for that post carceral reality. It's an outdated model. I mean, we do know this is a matter of data that there are no good outcomes from prison. We know that for there's no rehabilitation. And I'm saying that as an absolute. We know that nonviolent criminals go to prison and they become violent criminals. And we know that there's people who, you know, unfortunately, it becomes a scarlet letter when people do come out of prison, they matriculate out and they can't get a job. So they becomes a cycle. You do something that is illegal, largely because of necessity, because you can't get a job. I happen to be the child of a convict. My father, who spoke several languages, served 2 tours in Vietnam, honorable discharge. You know, he got out of prison and he couldn't get a job at IHOP and, you know, bussing tables. And so your options are very, very limited. And so I think that, you know, the notion of moving past that, where people actually have some sort of services, and, you know, I think this is largely where Gabe and I both agree on this, is that ultimately you have to be able to provide those things. There has to be something. It can't be a vacuum. So we're just not going to lock people up and then give them nothing as a support system. There has to be things in that place. And that's 100% real. And that's a matter of distribution, hopefully, when, you know, the money doesn't go toward prisons and it doesn't go toward militarized police and it doesn't go perhaps even to police at all, that it is providing more services. And that is not going to be a clean transition. It's not going to be completely victimless. There will be those times where there will be political and very real human consequences. Oh, this person wouldn't have done this if they had been incarcerated at that time. That will happen. And I guess the you know, flip side of that is that it happens anyway. There's those same consequences anyway. And if it's in pursuit of something greater, something more evolutionary for human beings that is not based upon bad science, like the carceral state, you know, perhaps then maybe it's, you know, something that at least is justifiable, understanding that it's going to happen and it does happen anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, my understanding is that most of, you know, defund the police actually does imply that now. All of these movements are heavily invested in it's actually a rediversion of funds, even though it says defund or demilitarize. And I also was turned off by the language originally, and then I started reading into it because I was curious, you know, why would you choose those words? And a lot of people take issue with that, and below the surface, I think it's going in the right direction. Yeah, I see that on the screen. I think that point is well taken. So we have just a couple of minutes left. There is I believe a ceremony and an action tonight in Paulsbo. I believe it's at 7 p.m. For Stonechild. I just wanted to draw the viewers' attention to that. And you guys if you guys want to add anything to that statement. And in the last few minutes we have, I'd like to hear from you guys again, who you are, and it's okay if you repeat yourself, who you are and what you're doing, and if there's anything else that would be helpful to add to this conversation, you know, because the world is having this conversation, at least on a small scale, and ideally on a larger scale as time progresses. So feel free to just jump in, but Gabe, I'll hand to you first and just ask you to kind of reiterate where you're coming from, who you are, and what can the viewer bring to the table to make the world a better place, and to perhaps to allow, you know, Stonechild's memory to be a part of us reimagining society.
Yeah, and thanks again, Tyler, and to your entire crew and organization for having both Gyasi and I. We appreciate the audience and the opportunity to amplify this message in his memory. Again, my name is Gabe Galanda. I belong to the Round Valley Indian Confederation. I descend from the Nomlaki and Concow tribes or bands of our confederation. I make my home now in Seattle, Washington, where I practice indigenous rights, including for the families of indigenous peoples who've lost their lives at the hands of police or through the neglect of local jails. For me, and I know it can feel sort of ineffective, but I think there's great power in making each and every one of our voices heard at a local level. It can take the form of activism in the streets. It can take the form of emails. It can take the form of calls. But I would like our audience to be the people who can change the system and change law. And I say that as a lawyer. But I think the power rests with our city councils. It rests with our county commissioners. It rests with our state legislators. I know it can feel like the call doesn't get responded to or the email doesn't get replied to, so I shouldn't try. But I can tell you, having talked to those elected officials, those things work. And so I would encourage people, including people in Paulsbo in memory of Stony, or in Kitsap County, or with access to people in Olympia, to use today to send the email or make the phone call and ask for reform. Ask for federal qualified immunity to be abolished at the local level. Ask for statutes like the felonious conduct bar to be repealed the next time the legislature convenes. Ask for more mental health funding at the state, local, and in turn, federal levels. Those people do have access to Washington, D.C. in ways we don't, and they can begin to advocate for our communities in terms of what we need, which in my estimation is greater mental health funding, support, and healthcare. So please, in his memory, my call to you all is to email and call somebody that you believe can help us do something to prevent the next Stonechild Chiefstick, or Renee Davis, or Cecil Lacey Jr., or Daniel Covarrubias from being taken from their loved ones and their children prematurely.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Gabe. Gyasi, you want to go next?
Yeah. Again, thank you, Tyler. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gabe. You know, I'm very fortunate to have somebody who I can call a friend, but also a colleague who has a mastery of these topics and is able to have such a wide field of experience, like with in these particular kind of cases. It's unfortunate that, you know, we talk about these things like they're cases. I mean, ultimately they have a case number, just like every other case, just like, you know, anything that goes to court, but they're human beings. And maybe this is a little bit closer to me because, again, I knew Stony. I know his family. I know his kids that no longer have a, supporting, loving dad. And he was a very, 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 very supporting, loving dad. Very much so, including for my children, by the way. He was always had kind words for kids. And it was just cool because it was a constant, positive influence from somebody that didn't necessarily have to do that. And, we have this tendency when somebody is killed by law enforcement to almost apologize and to say, well, this person did all these good things. This person was a straight A student. This person, always brushed their teeth, never chewed with their mouth open. They did all these. We have an elevated standard to say that our people shouldn't get killed by those who are being employed to protect us. Because that's really what it is. We're justifying their existence and saying, you know what, only if they've done these good things, then those people who he paid for, just like I pay for, just like all of you pay for, those folks not to kill us. He deserved not to die. But the truth is, none of us should. We shouldn't be in fear of those things. We shouldn't be in fear of those who are paid to protect us. We literally pay those salaries. And I think it's a hugely perverse paradigm that makes us even think that this is a risk that could happen. But we have to think about that. We have to think about that, specifically Black people, specifically Native people, specifically brown-skinned people. And I just want to, recalibrate and to, recenter the human being in this conversation. That what I saw, what I read when I'm reading the information, the public information on this case, is a person, as Gabe said very eloquently at the beginning, who was in need, who was vulnerable, who really, really should have been provided some form of service that didn't have a gun attached to it. I can't see any positive outcome that as a result of having people respond to crisis that has guns. I don't see those good outcomes. And we're seeing a plethora of bad outcomes as a result of that right now. They've been happening. It's not a new thing. But we need to rethink this entire paradigm, and we can call it defund the police. Tyler, we can call it whatever we want. I don't care. I'm not caught up in buzzwords, but we need to rethink this thing because it's not working, and it's particularly not working for us. Is something that's failing miserably for us, because when we reach out for help, there's somebody that sees threat. There's somebody with a gun that is fearful. And I can't say whether that fear is justified or whether it's, reasonable or whatever. But I would prefer that if somebody was innately programmed to fear me and I was reaching out for help, that they didn't have a gun. So that's all I want to say is that, I see when I look at, the information on this particular tragedy, I see somebody that really was reaching out for help. Somebody that, that presumably, like there was some stuff going on. Fine. There's stuff going on with all of us. Every single one of us. None of us is above that. And God forbid that that's what happens when any of us reach out for help. So I just want to, we have to rethink this. Gabe gave the action steps. Reach out to your city council, reach out to your legislators, definitely contact Bob Ferguson, Attorney General, talk to him. But also, we have to push this conversation about qualified immunity, about, we have to start seeing people as human beings. Otherwise, it's continue to persist, and it will affect people that look like me, that look like Stonechild, that look like Gabe in vastly disproportionate numbers. And if that's a truth that you can live with, then don't contact them. If you can't live with that, then holler.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Gyasi. We are out of time. So in memory of Stonechild's Chiefstick, let's all take some breaths and make whatever move makes sense. There are moves to be made, and obviously this conversation has brought some to light. If you don't have ideas, they can be provided. Unless either of you jumps in right now to add to it, I really appreciate your voices. For me, it's an honor to be able to sit at the table and elevate a couple of Indigenous voices, because we need that, and people are hungry for your voices. So I hope we can see you again, and I see you on the front lines of this individual battle and the greater war for making a better place. So keep it up, and please call me if there's anything more I can do, and we can do this again if that is helpful. Absolutely. And so I guess we'll take it out. Thank you, Oz and Jacob, for doing the behind the scenes work. This is Progressive Washington, hosted by Uphill Media and brought to you by the Washington State Progressive Party. This is Gabriel Galanda and Gyasi Ross, two of the lawyers in the case of Stonechild Chiefstick, who was killed by police a year ago today. And if you're anywhere near Paulsbo at 7 p.m. tonight, there is a ceremony and an action to raise awareness about this and honor the memory of this man who fell by the all too common police violence issue. Thanks, Oz. Go ahead and take us home.